Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be doing a general overview over the situation in Ukraine, and then I'll follow it up by doing a situation overview over the situation in Ukraine through the winter. So starting out in the front line, we see that Kherson and Zaporizhia is as stable as ever since the Ukrainians managed to capture Kherson after the Russian retreat. This front line has been stable due to the Dnieper River, as well as Zaporizhia generally having a very stable front line, as both sides have reinforced the front line ever since the Russians managed to capture it in April. Moving on to the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts, we see that the situation is also fairly stable here. There's been some minor advancements by the Russians that the Ukrainians have not been able to recapture. However, the Russians are meeting heavy resistance from the Ukrainian soldiers in these defensive positions. So generally speaking, the situation right now is a stalemate as both sides are preparing for the winter, and the way that they're preparing are two ways. The first one is that they're preparing their troops for the front line, where they're sending the troops themselves as well as their equipment and fixing up the logistical supports to these front lines. And the second way that they're preparing for this is by the Russians sending missiles to destroy the Ukrainian energy grid, while the Ukrainians are trying to gain more support from the West and get these heavy weapons that they need for the future incursions into Russian-controlled territory and to retake the territory that they've lost since the start of the war. Now, what is the winter going to be like in Ukraine? I've done some research to figure out exactly what is happening and how the Ukrainian winter is like. So starting out here, the year-round temperature, this is the average temperature in the different months. Generally speaking, we see that Ukraine is in a situation where the ground freezes and the temperature is in the negative degrees from mid-December to mid-February. And looking at this graph here with the average high and low temperature in the winter in Kiev, we see that already from mid-November, the low gets below the freezing point, while the high point only gets below the freezing point by late December. However, that doesn't mean that the ground will be muddy. With the average low being in the negatives, this means that most likely every night the temperature will be in the negatives, while in the daytime it will be in the positives, which means that in the night the ground freezes and then it dries up a bit in the day and then it freezes again in the night. So essentially we have to say it as it is, and that is the ground will be frozen from mid-December to mid-February. That is 2 months with a frozen ground in Ukraine. Now, who does it benefit to have a frozen ground? As we can see here, based on what has happened so far in Ukraine, there are 2 points we have to look at. The first one is that the numerical superiority is in Russia's favor now due to the mobilization and the extensive campaign to send more heavy equipment to the front line, while at the same time the quality seems to be in Ukraine's side, as they have a lot of troops who are well trained and well experienced, who are managing to take control over Russian territories at a fast pace, as the Russians decide to fall back every time the Ukrainians launch a massive offensive, as we've seen in Kharkiv and Kherson. So the current situation where the front line is as small as it is now due to the Russians pulling out of Kharkiv and Kherson and the Ukrainians recapturing these positions, it means that the density of the Russian forces has increased several folds, combined with the mobilization of Russian troops, which means that both sides have combined their forces to this smaller front line. And this means that the Russians actually have an advantage in this smaller front line, as their main use of weapons throughout this war has been artillery. And artillery shells are explosive devices, which means that they have an area of effect whenever they explode, which means that the larger the concentration of forces, the more casualties the opponent will receive. With the Russian superior firepower and numerical superiority when it comes to artillery, they're able to inflict much heavier casualties on the Ukrainian forces if the Ukrainian forces are concentrated, which they are forced to be on this small of a front line. However, something else that we might see is a Russian incursion from the north, similar to what we saw at the start of the war. This would be to draw out the Ukrainian forces from the front line in the south towards the north. And another possibility is the Russians trying to launch an offensive towards the Ukrainian positions in Kremenchuk as well as Poltava from the north, and Zaporizhzhia as well as Dnipro from the south. This is to cut off all the Ukrainian forces that we see here in the southeast, since the most Ukrainian forces are focusing on this front line here in the south to retake the last positions of the Russian forces in Ukraine. It leaves them vulnerable in the position where there's the river to the back of them, and if the Russians manage to launch a large-scale offensive with a lot of troops in less defended positions like the north of Kharkiv around the Sumy area towards Poltava and Kremenchuk, which are the main roads that the Ukrainian supply lines go through, they'll be able to cut off all supplies from the north, and if they launch an offensive through Zaporizhzhia, then they'll be able to cut off the river line from the Ukrainian positions. However, this will come at a very high casualty rate, as the Russians will be very vulnerable as they commence such an operation. And such an operation would have to happen once the ground is properly frozen, which would be by mid-December. So by mid-December, we'll be seeing the Russians attempting to launch a large-scale offensive, as they see it as the best possibility for them to get a large victory quickly. If they launch all their forces in these areas and encircle a large part of the Ukrainian forces, they'll be able to get a huge advantage. However, this is also a very risky situation, as the Ukrainians have also proven they're very good at guerrilla warfare, where they stand by and ambush the Russian supply lines as the Russians overextend themselves. However, with this large concentration of Russian forces, they may be able to succeed this time around compared to last time, where they had a very limited amount of soldiers. So the way the Ukrainians are preparing for this situation is that they're building very heavy fortifications around the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, especially here to the north and northeast of Kharkiv, where they're trying to prevent any future incursions by the Russian army. We're also seeing the Russians building fortifications around Belgorod. This actually gives more credibility to the theory that the Russians will try to attack Poltava, as if the Russians are going to attack Poltava, then that would leave Belgorod very vulnerable, and the Ukrainians will be able to start an incursion into Russia towards Belgorod to cut off all Russian supplies towards the incursion into Poltava. However, if they build a defensive line before they invade Ukraine from the northeast, then they will be able to block the Ukrainian counterattack and keep their supply line safe, which means they'll have to also have a very tough defensive position to the east of this incursion. According to the latest news, as I'm editing this video, the Ukrainians have announced that they are lacking about 100,000 pieces of winter equipment, winter uniforms, and this is after the Canadians have announced that they would send 500,000 pieces of winter uniforms and equipment, which means that they need about 600,000 and they've only received 500,000, so they're lacking 100,000. And this is on top of the fact that Sweden and Finland are also sending help, and since they are northern countries, they have a lot of winter equipment. However, I think this is the same for Finland, but for Sweden, they have announced that the reason they haven't sent that much is because they've used up a lot of their stockpile and haven't had time to replenish, so they're trying to replenish it as quickly as possible, and they're now prioritizing their own replenishment over sending it to Ukraine. And all in all, this is the general situation over Ukraine, specifically throughout the winter. That's all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. See you all.